let me present to you the panelists. We have Kendal Blust, who is a senior field correspondent with NPR member station KJZZ's Fronteras desk at the station's bureau in Hermosillo, Sonora. She covers a wide range of stories from the northern Mexico, including cross-border business and trade, immigration, education, and the environment. Much of her work has also focused on women's movements and gender violence in Sonora. In 2021, Kendal and her colleague Murphy Woodhouse were recognized by the Public Media Journalists Association for the reporting on violence and femicides in Sonora in the series Rising Violence Test Sonora. We have Alice Driver, who is a bilingual journalist based in Mexico City. Her narrative, nonfiction, feature writing, and audio work have appeared in magazines including National Geographic, Time, CNN, Cosmopolitan, Outside, Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting, and Long Reads. Her book projects include More or Less Dead, Femicide, Haunting, and the Ethics of Representation in Mexico that came out from the University of Arizona Press in 2015, and a translation of Abecedario de Juárez, a collaboration with journalist Julian Cardona and artist Alice Leora Briggs that explores and maps the new language of violence in Mexico, which is forthcoming from the University of Texas Press. And last but never least, we have Cristina Rivera Garza, who is an author, translator, and critic. Some of her recent publications include El Invencible Verano de Ilana, which is soon to be translated by the author herself as Liliana's Invincible Summer. Andamos Perras, Andamos Diablas, and she has some upcoming publications with new and selected stories with the Dorothy Project in 2022. It just came out, I think, yeah. Grieving Dispatches from a Wounded Country, translated by Sarah Booker, Feminist Press 2020, was shortlisted in the 2021 NBCC Awards in Criticism. Recent awards include José Donoso International Literary Award from Chile, Alfonso Reyes Nuevo León International Literary Award, Mexico 2021. She's a distinguished professor and the founder of the PhD program in creative writing in Spanish at the University of Houston, at the Department of Hispanic Studies, and she was a MacArthur Fellow in 2020. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. If you guys want to take your masks off so that the interpreter can read your lips as well, that's appreciated. And this panel, from the private to public, facing femicide, the idea here is that we're going to expand on what our first panelists started discussing and think about how do we move from femicide and violence against women as a private problem of individuals to think about it more systemically, to think about what the public-facing aspects of the addressing the problem can do. So I guess I'm going to start with, can you tell us about your personal connection to and the interest in preventing gender-based violence and how your work has shaped and also been shaped by the public narrative around such violence, and in its extreme case, femicide. Sort of a question about journalism, working in Mexico, publishing very confrontational work in Mexico. Do you find yourselves concerned about being targets of violence because of speaking out publicly? Thank you.
Okay, is this on? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I really appreciate that question about, the personal connection. I think in journalism, that question can sometimes be fraught because we are often taught about the need for objectivity, which I think is, has been brought into question in recent years of what that means. And I think as a woman reporting on issues of femicide and gender violence, there has to be a personal connection. I think as women, we've all experienced different and varying levels of gender violence. But for me, I've been working in Sonora for almost 4 years now in Hermosillo, and it has deeply impacted me both professionally and personally in the ways that I see gender violence and understand it in a context in Mexico and in Sonora, but also more generally, the word femicide and concepts of gender violence is something that I've of course thought about, but the incredible mass movements that have been going on during my years there have really made me see the ways that gender violence impacts us everywhere as well. And I've been incredibly inspired by the women who've been taking this battle to the streets in such a public way and really drawing public attention to this issue. And as a reporter, my goal is to bring that issue even more to light. I report from Sonora, but here my reporting comes out in the US and on the Arizona side of the border. And I hope that it both reflects what's happening in Sonora and helps people to think about what's happening there, but also to connect it to what's happening here and for women here in Arizona and in the United States as well. Because obviously we have very similar issues that affect us on both sides of the border. Your question also about risks and what it means to be a reporter in Mexico. Speaking for myself, as a US citizen who's in Mexico, I have a lot of privilege, and I think it's something really important to recognize that the dangers to me are very different than a lot of my colleagues who are reporters and activists working in Mexico. My reporting, again, comes out in English. It's published in the United States. And I also have that support of being a US citizen. But in a general sense, and for a lot of women, speaking out about gender violence can be incredibly risky. And, we've had some incredibly potent examples of that in Sonora and across Mexico. Violence against journalists, specifically in Mexico, has been just exploding. Mexico has, for years now, been one of the deadliest places in the world for reporters. And this year, that has become incredibly apparent, with at least 8 journalists murdered already this year in less than 3 months. But we've also seen it for other people who are speaking out publicly about these issues and being active. We have many groups of women who are searching for disappeared, which is an incredibly important part of this conversation, because all of the numbers that we have are only, again, crimes that are reported, murders that we know about, and disappearances in Sonora and Mexico are a huge part of that are not counted in these numbers. And we've seen threats, kidnappings, murders of women who are searching for missing loved ones in the past couple of years. We've seen women who are out protesting for women's rights murdered. In November, Marisol Cuadras, an 18-year-old woman who was protesting in Guaymas in Sonora, was killed in a shootout in that city, and not specifically because of her work, but again, highlighting that speaking out, being in public, and just being in the streets as a woman puts you at risk. And so I think I am extremely lucky not to feel specifically targeted for my work, but I think that is very much the case for many women.
So my story begins in rural Arkansas. I was born in a town of 200, and you might think, okay, what does this have to do with femicide? But growing up in a very rural, very conservative area, I acutely remember I always wanted to be a writer. And so I remember all the things that I was told, even as a child, you're never going to be able to support yourself. You're never going to be able to have children. Maybe I don't want children. Just all of these things that even in elementary school, which I went to a very rural school, I had no access to other languages. Only everybody speaks English. in the library, I was told, you know, those books aren't for girls. Things like this have stuck with me, and it's really shaped my career in terms of when I finally did get to college and I did have access to study a language, and I started studying Spanish, and I was very upset that I had never had access to learn another language, and I so desperately wanted to learn it. And I ended up studying in Mexico and getting very interested in literature and culture and immersing myself in that world. And so I really came to studying femicide through an interest in all of these tiny acts of violence, like a million paper cuts that I think women, not just in Mexico, that women everywhere grow up living with, that, you know, you can say, oh, you weren't allowed to read certain books at the library because you were a girl. You know, that's not a big deal, but it is an act. It's a small act of violence. And so even though this seems like a very strange story of how I grew up in Arkansas and then I ended up writing about femicide in Mexico, these are the things that have always interested me as a writer and that I focus on even when I'm writing about climate change or migration. I am looking at it from the lens of gender. And I think that's really important because women and non-binary people are extremely underrepresented. For example, in photography, how many people, what % of photographers worldwide are women or non-binary? Any guesses? 1, it's more than that. Any other guesses? 10 is closer. So worldwide, it's 15%. So of all the images that we're seeing in the news, only 15% are taken by women. And I think of that all the time when I see femicide in the news, whether in Mexico or in the US, when I see a mutilated body or a title that says crime of passion, I think, who wrote that? Were there no women in the room? Absolutely, that's what runs through my mind. And that's what motivates me all the time to do my work and to support other women who are doing the same kind of work.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for organizing this conference. I'm going to start by sharing the story that brings me here in the first place. On July 16th, 1990, my younger sister, Ilana Rivera Garza, was a victim of a femicide. Months later, a judge in Mexico City found that she had enough information, had gathered enough evidence to issue an arrest warrant against Angel Gonzalez Ramos, who was by then her ex-boyfriend. This Angel Gonzalez Ramos ran away and remains at large, allegedly in the United States today. So 30 years ago, the story that I just summarized in this paragraph was not told in this way. 30 years ago, people used the language that we associate to the term passionate crime to tell this story. And as you well know, the very concept of passionate crime is usually employed in order to blame the victim and exonerate the perpetrator. So it's very hard actually to tell these stories of violence against women, stories of femicide in the language of patriarchy that essentially invites this language, condones this language, and perpetuates in many ways this language. So as a writer, it has taken me about 30 years to be able to interrogate this language of patriarchy, to gather personal strength, to talk about it openly, but also it has taken society and our community in general these 30 years to develop a language precise enough, respectful enough to tell these stories from the point of view of the victim. So I owe the tireless work of women's mobilizations feminist and non-feminist. They're equally important. The tireless work of organizations like Observatorio, that Silvia spoke so eloquently about it earlier. The kind of work that is done on the streets and by people related to this kind of horrendous acts. So this year, I published the book that Ilana mentioned at the start of this panel, El Invencible Verano de Liliana, which will be out in English as Liliana's Invisible Summer. I was finally able to write this book, which obviously is the story of my life. It's the story that I've been trying to write forever. I finally did it because I opened up the boxes where we had placed the belongings of my sister 30 years ago. I was trying to go back to the case. I was trying to see if we could do, if there was still something that we could do about this case. And I was looking essentially for information, some agendas, names. And what I found was a very generous archive that my sister had been building, had built about her own experience on Earth. So a plethora of letters, notes, blueprints, postcards, the kind of message that I received as an instruction in a way to tell her story. So answering your question, I think is incredibly important to think about these horrendous acts of violence as not belonging to the private realm of life. These are issues of social concern and relevance. These are structural to the way in which we live. And speaking openly and with great precision about them, I think it's our first step in order to identify and therefore prevent these crimes to take place again. So I'm not a journalist, but I've been doing the work of, I do a lot of research. So, and I do believe that research is a form of care. That is the caring that allows me to tell the story of my sister as closely to her own words, as closely to her own way of looking at life that I could. And in general terms, I could say that for many years, my family and I were we were in a very forcibly silenced kind of mourning. People who have been through this experience know the mourning for women that we have lost to this kind of violence is a very tricky, perverse thing. There is a lot of guilt and there is a lot of shame involved there. After the publication of my book, I have to say that the pour of support has been incredible, and the empathy that it has generated has been incredibly important as well. So this is a wound that will never heal, of course, but the mourning, the process has changed tremendously from something that was silent and individual to a practice, in fact, that is now collective and is part of a larger embrace. I am still working with a legal team trying to bring this case to justice. And as I was reminded by Sayuri Herrera, who is the head of the Fiscalía de Feminicidios in Mexico, there is much to be done. We received some information about the possibility that this individual, the presunto feminicida, died in the United States a couple of years ago. We don't know that yet. It's teams of police teams, international police teams are trying to confirm that information. But as Sayuri told me, even if that is the case, there is much to be done in terms of a larger concept of justice, one that involves obviously the work with memory and the seeking of the truth. We are now fighting, I want the word femicide to be included in any kind of documentation related to Liliana. And that's how the process is right now. And if you have questions later, we can continue with it. Thank you.
Thank you. I know, thank you, Cristina. I know it is very hard to talk about these things publicly without feeling that pain really fresh. So thank you for being willing to share this with us. It's really brave and wonderful. So I want to come back to this question of what can writing do? And not just writing, we can extend it to other forms of public art and photojournalism, audio journalism, filmmaking. And I would add public protests, such as the protests that have been happening in Mexico with the glitter, et cetera. So could you talk about what are your goals personally as writers or as journalists as you confront gender violence and other sorts of social violence? And then what, if any, have been your achievements? What are you proud of? What has been achieved with this sort of public-facing work that you do?
I've always believed that stories live on inside of us, and I can say that, for example, the work of Cristina, who I've never met before today, lives on in me. And it's a very personal thing, but you sometimes, I think, very infrequently can you measure, at least in my own work, I will admit, the impact of what you're doing in the moment. I think if you're lucky, you might know that impact in your lifetime. And for example, in my own work, I cannot think, for example, I have not individually or even collectively changed a law with my writing. I mean, I've often felt like I maybe contributed to a discourse that then began to change the discussion. And I guess the best example of this would be that when I started writing my book in 2008, the term femicide, nobody, every time I said that I was writing a book about femicide, people would say, what? What's that? And at that time, for example, in Mexico, there was no law related to femicide being a crime. And so in the course of writing my book, by the time it came out in 2015, all of this changed. People began to recognize the term, the laws changed. Can I say that I was personally integral to that? I cannot. I cannot. My work is just a drop in a bucket. But once you begin that work, you do start making connections and networks and doing the kind of work, for example, that Sylvia is doing, that is often extremely lonely in the beginning, or maybe throughout the entire time you're doing this kind of work. Lonely, alienated, or you're often feeling threatened or worried about your safety or worried about the safety of people that you're working with. And, as Kendal said, as an American working in Mexico, we definitely have a level of privilege that local journalists do not have. So I can't say that I have personally been threatened over this work. I do think that's an issue of local journalists working on the ground in Mexico. So in terms of changes, I think it's a belief for me in the power of storytelling, and the hope that as a collective with these other women that I know or that I've met or that I don't even know, but I know the work that they're doing because I see it, and it is powerful to me to see them out there doing it in defiance of norms and standards and everything that the government or the law is saying about what we should be doing or what this kind of violence should be classified as. So I think change is, action, change is found in action. And I've always put my faith in that.
Yeah, that's thank you. I agree. It's really hard to look at your work and as a writer or journalist and to say, here's something that I've concretely been able to achieve. I think, as you mentioned, it is also not just those of us who are writing the stories about it, but it's the protests and it's the activists who are on the ground collecting data and information about these issues, who are helping women and who hear their stories and are able to share them with a broader audience. And I think as a journalist, my goal is to take this work and to take these incredibly difficult battles that women in Mexico, and specifically in my case in Sonora, are waging, and to do what I can to amplify their voices and to help a wider audience see what's happening, and to maybe take some time and to think about it and to recognize it. And I guess, you know, I have sometimes been surprised, but also maybe glad to hear people say, oh, I had no idea about that, or I had no idea that the situation was so serious. And I think that those things are important. It's important because when those stories are heard, other women feel seen. They recognize that they're not alone. Maybe they can identify things in their own lives that they wouldn't have otherwise. You know, we were talking earlier, maybe you've seen today this scale, these degrees of violence that has become incredibly popular. I see it a lot in Sonora right now, and I think it's really important. And I think that's something that we can do is maybe people aren't thinking about what it means when someone is possessive or jealous or makes an embarrassing comment, and where that falls. You know, I hope that both as women, we're recognizing when these things are happening to ourselves and to others, but also as a society in general, that we are not letting those things slide or accepting them as normal. And I think, well, Sylvia and Noemi talked about this normalization of this violence that ultimately, yes, you know, may become femicide or more extreme forms of violence, but that are where we see as so commonplace around us. And I think just hoping to see people think about those things. And for me, a goal has been to just try and keep it in the news, to keep it coming up, and, you know, not just when the latest statistics are out or when there is a mass protest, but behind that, who are the people who are working day to day on these things? What are the things that are happening around us all the time that maybe we don't see because sometimes they are private, or because we just think it's normal. And like Alice so poignantly said, it's hard to really know most of the time if that's making any kind of a difference. But I think a lot of the work is just continuing to try and continuing, yeah, hopefully to amplify the voices of these people who are doing such important work.
I agree, certainly. I do believe that I do believe that language is action. Language is a verb. And silence ties us up, silence strangles us, silence asphyxiates us, silence kills us. And the way in which we tell stories is the way we live, right? Is the way we aspire to live. And so as a writer, for me, it's incredibly important, it's fundamental to be able to interrogate the dominant language in our society. There are dominant narratives that have forced many of us to remain silent. There are dominant narratives that have relegated our experiences to the margins. And I think it's politically, ethically, aesthetically relevant to participate, to contribute to the telling of those stories. And in order to do so, I think it all starts with this interrogation of language as such, of the narratives that that makes us live. And so I would like to think, I always think of writing as a critical practice. I think of writing as a practice that we do with others. It does appear that we write by ourselves, isolated in front of a computer, in a room, if we're lucky, right? But in fact, we're writing with language and in language, which means that we're always writing with others and about others. We're always telling someone else's story, even if we're talking about ourselves. So understanding that goes to the root of my understanding of writing as a practice that connects, as a practice that has consequences. So I'm extremely happy when I see a generation of young women taking the streets and taking language on their own and telling stories that are completely different. And I'm very happy when I see the rage is there, building a different future. We need that energy, and we need the words that come with that rage, with that revelation, with that sense of our responsibility as well. And so it all comes back to the words that are action, to that language that is a verb. I'm completely convinced of that. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to open up questions to the audience for our panelists, either from Zoom or from out here in the public. And I'll start over there.
Hi, thank you for your work and your writing. Given the nature of the things you write about, right, can be frequently difficult to deal with both personally as well as sort of on a public level. So my question is more or less, how do you check in on yourself? How do you maintain the ability and the capacity to keep writing, given the difficulty of the content as well as the urgent, and also knowing that there's an urgency to the material? You know, often when you're reporting something that happens yesterday or today, you know, how do you sort of keep doing it, knowing that it's really hard to talk about?
Well, you guys want to jump in on that?
Thank you for that question. I think it can be hard, and sometimes it's very emotionally exhausting. I think also, especially as a woman, you know, these can be extremely personal stories that are deeply impactful. I think for me as a journalist, one of the ways that I keep doing it, though, is that, you know, this is something I believe in. I think the power of writing, and I think the power of journalism. You know, I want to do this work because it felt like a way of trying to make an impact and trying to chip away at these issues around us. And so, you know, going back to it's hard sometimes to know how much of a difference it's making. And I think that for me is the hardest part of it. The question is there something else that I should be doing? Is there a different way I should be doing it? But it is the way that I think that I know and that I have now of trying to do something. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't feel like enough, but it's I think helpful to me in that way of feeling like it is an outlet for me as well.
I want to talk about joy in some context. Even this work is very hard. It's emotional, obviously it's deeply felt, But in the context of doing this work, I've met such an incredible network of women in ways that are very unexpected. For example, with my book, this amazing Mexican photographer ended up giving me a photo of hers that she had taken of mothers in Juarez who were looking for their missing daughters. When I was covering, one year when I was covering the protests of women in Mexico City on March 8th for International Women's Day, I was looking for tacos and I ran into Elena Poniatowska, who's a Mexican writer who I'm a big fan of in the street, and I know what she looks like because I read a lot of her books. And so I chased her down and she invited me to coffee, and we ended up having this incredible discussion about her work. And so for me, there've been all these moments and connections in terms of the joy and the creativity that I find with working on these issues with other people who are also very engaged in ways that give me strength.
So true. I was thinking exactly that. In order to write these stories or to write just in general, I think we need to be very proactive in building communities, around us, and being very aware that we're participating of larger conversations. Someone else has already said it or thought about it, and just connecting with these communities of people, I think, is incredibly important to continue. And we can do that more forcefully when we realize that we cannot do anything by ourselves, when we therefore question the very idea of the individual, right? Or the I as an isolated entity. So it's been very helpful for me, and I guess that's the reason why I insist so much on the idea that writing is a collective, collaborative practice, that we're always paying attention to and articulating with others. And the more we know that, and the more we contribute actively to that, I think that's where the energy comes from, that we are part of something that goes beyond ourselves. But that is very rooted on personal experience, concerns, and interests. That doesn't mean that has to be an individual affair as such.
Now a question from Zoom. This one. This is a specific question for Cristina, which is, in writing about your personal experience with your sister, what are the resources you have had access to in your research? And what has been the authorities and institutions' role in your research? And do you think that other people in similar situations can access such resources to help them?
Well, what an interesting, important question indeed. One of the challenges about writing stories involving this horrific violence is, we know the extreme, that femicides become numbers very often. The other risk, of course, is that we tend to concentrate on violence itself. And at times we forget that these women had lives, complex lives, paradoxical lives, interesting lives as well. So in terms of the resources for writing specifically this book, I would say that if I hadn't had access to the words that my sister curated, to the archive that she built of herself, I wouldn't have been able to tell this story, which is a story about her life. And it's a story about how violence grows little by little and takes hold without much noticing. And therefore, this is why it's so important to talk about and to speak about these lenses so that we can identify issues earlier and prevent them. I've been working with with other resources. I had to do research in newspapers, and some journalist friends of mine have been helping me with that. I've been talking with people like Sayuri Herrera, who's been tremendously helpful, just guiding me and orienting me in a world that I had very little knowledge of. I've been in contact with authorities in Mexico, and I think I've experienced the same kind of frustration and the same kind of irritation when processes are incredibly slow, and when indifference in many ways is what prevails in issues that relate to gender violence. And so I think I've learned from the experience of so many families in Mexico who have been facing this reality. And I would like to say that in this case, something different is going to happen. But sadly, I think what I've been facing is what other families have. I suppose that the main difference here is that I had that archive. I had Liliana's words, and just building, reconstructing that life based on her own words is what to me was so relevant in this specific writing project. Is writing allows us, I believe, at the very bottom, to communicate with those who are not with us. And in this way, writing is a way of communicating with our death. And so having access to Liliana's own words is a way of bringing her back and sharing her with all of you, with all the readers. And I think that's very important in her case, and in the case of all the women who have died in these circumstances. They are with us, and just being very clear about that. They remain with us, and they are guiding us with their pain, with their grace, and with their knowledge as well. I think that's, yeah.
Thank you. We're going to have more discussion later after we have lunch and a screening of Las Tres Muertes de Marisela Escobedo, the 3 deaths of Marisela Escobedo, and a Q&A with the director. We're going to have all of our panelists back to be talking more, so don't worry if you didn't get to ask your question. I wanted to make just 2 points before we close this session. One, just thank you, and what Cristina is saying about the book about Liliana. I would add that the way that you approach the archive of your sister's life really gives us a roadmap to approaching those lives around us, right? And it gives us sort of signposts to see violences and problems that should worry us, that we might not otherwise recognize. And of course, your work is based on other people's work. It's a conversation, as you've said. And then the last thing I wanted to mention and make very explicit is that when we say women, we mean all women. We mean cis women and trans women. And when we speak of gender violence, we're discussing violence against people whose gender expressions go against the norm, people who are non-binary, people who are trans, as well as people who live in women's bodies of all sorts. So I want to make that very clear because it's really important that that be part of our conversation. Thank you guys, and thank you so much.